We've gathered three writers from the hometown paper, so to speak, here in the nation's capital, the Washington Post, to talk about Senator John McCain. Dan Balz is the chief correspondent covering national politics, the presidency, and Congress. Michael Gerson is a nationally syndicated columnist, and columnist Karen Tumulty wrote the paper's lead story this morning on the life of John McCain. And Karen, I know you'd been working on this for some time. You had amazing anecdotes in there. One that stood out to me was McCain as a child, you said. He had such stubbornness. He once held his breath until he almost passed out.
He actually did pass out. I think his personality became clear very early, and he would have these tantrums where he would hold his breath until he passed out. And his mother went to a Navy doctor who said, next time that happens, just take him fully clothed and drop him in a tub of cold water. So that's how she would deal with it.
I don't think it worked. I don't think that really changed the character. You know, John Dickerson, our colleague there, was sharing what he had heard, which was last night in Arizona as the senator's body was being taken from his home. There were people just gathered on the side of the road saluting him one last time, sort of an informal tribute to John McCain. Mm-hmm. Dan, you know, we talk a lot about the sparring he's doing with the current president, mm-hmm. but there is still that deep respect that is coming there, and you saw last night in Arizona.
I think you're seeing it everywhere. I mean, not just from politicians and the kinds of statements that we're hearing from everyone who's had their life touched by John McCain. I got an email from a friend this morning who's up in upstate New York who was at a diner for breakfast, and people were talking about McCain there and what a patriot he was. So, I mean, I think his impact goes way beyond just the pure political system. I think people look at him for what he was, which was a patriot and an American. And I think that set of values is something that I think people find in short supply today, and they look at McCain's life and his example and they think we need more of that.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of desperation in some of this, that we don't have it in as much as we need. This is a time when we need heroes, and this is a hero passing from the scene. So I think there's a bittersweet element to this. He was the polar opposite to the president on many things, and really played that role.
I also think that what we're seeing here is the passing of a generation when it was expected that our national leaders would have early in their lives served. And, you know, John McCain is one of the last of that breed, too.
Yeah. You heard John Dickerson say that some Republicans he had talked to referred to this as the dying of a principle, not just the dying of a patriot, but that McCain would have rejected that description. What do you make of that?
I think he would have rejected it. I think he viewed America in a certain way, through a certain lens, as a place of ideals and principles, not just a land, not just a piece of property, but the carrier of a human ideal. And this is what he talked about. The reason he was critical of a lot of current foreign policy was, you know, he was a voice for oppressed people around the world. He could have just been a hawk, you know, and a defense hawk as a senator. And he spoke up for the people of Vietnam. He spoke up for the people around Asia who knew his name from Radio Asia. This is someone who cares about me. And that was really a great role that he played about, you know, extending American values.
It was certainly a role he put himself in the past year since the election of President Trump. I'm thinking of him going to the Munich Security Conference and standing up in front of European allies despite being, you know, not feeling well, and saying basically, don't forget us, and I'm going to stand up for Western values. America is still here. Who is that voice now?
I think it remains to be seen who that voice is, but I also think it is much more difficult to do what John McCain has done throughout his life in the current era we're in. I mean, one of the things I think his passing represents is the passing of a certain era. I mean, he operated at a time when he had principles that he lived in ways that other politicians didn't, and yet at the same time, there was a greater acceptance of the kinds of ambitions and values that he was trying to represent, i.e. working across party lines to get things done, recognizing that compromise is a way to get progress, an ability to have fights with people and move on. We're in a different time. It is a much more, as we've talked a lot about, it's a much more poisonous time politically. I think that Senator McCain's passing reminds us of how difficult it will be for someone to step into those shoes.
And Karen, the president is not part of this tribute, and that was a choice being made by the McCain family. What do you make of that?
I think that this president and John McCain are just polar opposites in so many ways. And one thing is in the sort of code of honor with which John McCain lived. It both defined him and it haunted him. The lowest moments of his life were when he betrayed his own principles. When he, in Vietnam, it wasn't being beaten and having his arms broken, but it was signing a forced confession, vague, that admitted to black crimes. To him, that was the single low moment. And I think we don't see, Donald Trump prides himself on never apologizing for anything, never looking back. That is the exact opposite of John McCain, who was always sort of trying to perfect himself to the point where he could live up to his own code of honor.
You wrote about that, saying it pained him to think that that moment of breaking might have hurt his father and caused him great embarrassment. And yet he used that to go on and fight his own party, even at times, on this issue of enhanced interrogation techniques and torture.
He was, and it was, he was John Sidney McCain III. He was named after his father and his grandfather, the first two men in the history of our country to go on to become four-star admirals. And then the weight of that name and what it represented also was just part of who he was.
I also think that the invitation to President George W. Bush to give this speech is an important one. You mentioned torture. They disagreed about that. This was one of the toughest rivalries in American politics.
It was a pretty tough fight they had.
I was on the other side of that, McCain Express in 2000. We thought it was going to run us over. And it was
you were a speechwriter.
Yeah, but over the years, McCain and George W. Bush have talked on the phone quite a bit. And even more in the period during his illness.
About what?
Well, I think about old times, former football players, that talk about old rivalries. But it became very warm, I think a genuine friendship. And Senator McCain asked President Bush to give the eulogy months ago as he was thinking about who he wanted at his own funeral. So I think it's a sign of reconciliation in a lot of ways, a good one.
He asked George W. Bush, he asked Barack Obama, the two men who really defeated him in his bids for the presidency. I mean, what is the message that the senator was going for in choosing those two individuals?
Well, I think the message is, personally, he always moved on. I mean, he didn't live in yesterday with all of its recriminations.
And yet President Trump.
Yeah, we moved on to the next stage, and I think that this represents that. I mean, both of these were rivals, but these were the kind of rivals where they believed the other side was going to serve the country. They had different views, but similar goals, and I think we're losing some of that.
The conflict with President Trump is interesting because from President Trump to John McCain is personal attack. He's not a hero just because he got shot down. That's the way he has gone at that. John McCain has opposed President Trump on principles. Mm-hmm. President Trump says America first. John McCain is country first. There's a real difference in that. And I think that that's the way each of these politicians has approached the way they try to do their jobs. And I think it says everything about the difference between the two.
And in that final memoir of John McCain, he talks a lot about what President Trump has really represented, some of those threats that he says to that country first principle, the nativism he talks about, his frustration with the inability to get immigration reform through, his frustration with the country in many ways, but he is still an optimist.
He
at
is
the
an
end there.
optimist, he's a realist, but I think that at his heart, he is a fighter. And he's a fighter for the principles that he has believed in. I mean, this notion of fighting for a cause larger than yourself can, sound corny and cliched. He lived that. And I think that that's why the battles that he has been engaged in, both before President Trump and currently with President Trump, flow out of the same set of principles.
And Karen, one of the things that perhaps sticks in the president's mind, not only the vote on health care, but also, and he writes about this in The Restless Wave, is the decision to receive this so-called Steele dossier when he was in Europe, and to be the one who brought that to the FBI and hand it to Jim Comey.
But that really was Senator McCain doing the responsible thing. And again, very much of a contrast with the meeting in Trump Tower, where a foreign adversary is offering the Trump campaign dirt on Hillary Clinton, and they take the meeting. Senator McCain's impulse was to turn it over to law enforcement.
And he writes about that was why he chose that, the justification for it. And yet in this environment, it is filtered as just a political choice, not one of principle here.
Yeah, I mean, but so much of it, everything today is filtered through that political lens. And people will, there are people who take issue with John McCain for a variety of reasons. And whenever there is a moment in which John McCain is in the news, those people come out to trash him. But as I say, I think that the way McCain approached his life and approached everything he did was to stand up for America, to stand up, as Mike said, for oppressed people, for the underdog, and to keep fighting and even when losing, to get back up and keep going.
Senator Flake of Arizona, when I asked him, who takes up this mantle, said, there are many people who can. There's a very real question: who takes Senator McCain's seat in Congress, and who will, in this upcoming primary race that's also being fought right now in Arizona, ultimately take the seat that Jeff Flake is retiring from? Who literally takes the mantle?
Well, I don't know that we can say that anybody can take the mantle. Someone can fill the seat, but that's quite different from from taking the mantle. And I think that has to be in the heart and soul of other people as they watch these last days in which we will be talking about John McCain day in and day out and thinking about the example that he had. It will be up to others to try to summon up some of what McCain has represented and see if they can take it on.
Is it overstating things to call it the death of romantic conservatism, as some have?
Well, I do think there is a generational element. I was with John McCain in the last days of the 1996 campaign. During 96 hours where we went straight, Bob Dole went straight. He was going to lose, Dole was going to lose, but the person who rode on the plane with him was John McCain. And we were at a bowling alley at 2 a.m. where Dole lost his voice, and McCain had to provide that voice. And the points he made about service and sacrifice in praising that generation brought everyone to tears. It was just extraordinary. Who has the ability, the standing to be that voice? And I think that's an open question.
And yet I think that if you look at his concession speech in 2008, where he was actually celebrating the moment that the country had reached, even as he's conceding defeat, he was a remarkable man.
He was, and I know we will all be watching as he is honored this week. Thank you for sharing your stories about him. And thank all of you for joining us this morning. We'll be back in a moment.